So this is the third video in my video series that deals with the brain. The first video talks about the different folds of the brain, what is a sulcus, what's a fissure. It talked about the cerebral spinal fluid, the meninges, and these things called ventricles. The second video I have focuses on the telencephalon, which is the cerebrum. Now in this video, we're going to look at the rest of the parts of the brain, but just as a little review, when we take the brain, we do divide it into three main sections. We have the forebrain, the midbrain, and the hindbrain. And that can be a little misconceiving because people tend to think the forebrain as just being the front of the brain, the midbrain as being the middle of the brain, and the hindbrain being the back of the brain. And in reality, that is not the case. In the case of the midbrain, which this video will discuss, you cannot see from the outside. The midbrain is buried in the middle of your brain. It's got a lot of white matter, which means that these nerves are highly myelinated. They produce a lot of electricity and they're buried in order to be protected. Most of what people think of as the brain, all of this here, is what we call the forebrain. And the forebrain's real name is the proencephalon, and it contains the telencephalon, which is the cerebrum, and the diencephalon, which is the thalamus and the hypothalamus, which we're going to talk about in this video today. The portion back here at the bottom is the hindbrain. The hindbrain really isn't in the back, it's more towards the bottom, and that's what we call the rhombencephalon, and this video will focus on that today as well. So just again, the proencephalon is commonly called the forebrain. It contains the telencephalon, which is the cerebrum, and I have a video in this nervous system series that talks just about that. And then the diencephalon, which this video is going to talk about. We're also going to talk about the mesencephalon, which is called the midbrain, and two important groups of ganglion that we find in it. And then the rhombencephalon, which is the hindbrain. Now, in the case of the diencephalon is part of your forebrain. It is part of the proencephalon. The proencephalon has two parts. The telencephalon, which is the cerebrum, which is the largest portion of your brain. It contains your four lobes. And then the diencephalon. When you look at the outside of the brain, you cannot see the diencephalon because it is found inside. Now, di meaning two, there are two parts to it. We have the hypothalamus and we have the thalamus. Now, in the case of the thalamus is something called a relay station. If you think about track and field, or if you think about swimming, when people run relays, they take turns. So like if you are a swimmer, when they have a relay race, one swimmer swims the length of the pool, hits the wall, the next swimmer jumps in. Or if you're running a relay race, you pass a baton from one person to the next. Well, that's what happens at a relay station. You have so much information coming to your brain. Your brain has to slow it down and figure out, okay, what's important and what's not. What can I ignore? What can I just totally throw away? And once information gets to the brain, okay, what part of the brain does it need to go to? And so we have several different relay stations in our brain, and the thalamus is one example of that. So information coming to the brain, or even information leaving the brain, or information passing through the brain, will go through a series of relay stations. And at this relay station, the information gets to the center of the brain, and the thalamus says, okay, I need you to go to the occipital lobe, or I need you to go down through this cranial nerve, or I need you to go to the parietal lobe. So it basically takes information that's coming to the brain, or even leaving the brain, and figures out, okay, this is where I need you to go. It also contains a portion of the brain that we commonly call the limbic system. And the limbic system, we know, has something to do with emotions. Now, we don't really know why we have emotions. Why do we cry when we're happy? Why do we cry when we're sad? We don't really know how emotions work, but we do know that this portion of the brain is the portion of the brain that has something to do with that. And keep in mind, a lot of what we know about the brain is based on studying people who've had brain trauma or brain injury. Because, if a certain part of the brain is damaged, we can study that person's personality. And, if their personality is different, then we can figure out, okay, well, this part of the brain had something to do with that feature or that ability to do something. This portion of your brain is also oftentimes linked with autism. A lot of people on the autistic spectrum do have problems with emotions, and some of them even have to be taught when to react in certain ways. And studies have shown that this portion of the brain may be affected. Underneath the thalamus, we have the hypothalamus, and this is what we call the regulator. The hypothalamus has its fingers in lots of different pies. The hypothalamus is considered to be in charge of your endocrine system. The endocrine system controls all the hormones of your body. Now, your hypothalamus doesn't make all the hormones, but it pretty much knows what all the hormones in your body is doing. Okay. It's in control of your blood pressure. It is control of your heart rate. Now, your heart creates its own beat, but your hypothalamus can tell your heart to speed up or slow down or beat normally. It also is the part of your brain that's in charge of making sure that our body temperature is always around 98.6 degrees. It's the part of our brain that's responsible for water balance. It does the negative feedback of thirst. It can regulate, along with other organs in your bodies and hormones, how much water you have in your blood, and therefore it can tell you to be thirsty or not to be thirsty. It also is the part of your brain that controls your sleep cycles. And like I said, it is in charge of your endocrine system, which are all the hormones of your body. Now, it itself makes two of your hormones. One of the hormones it makes is called vasopressin. It's also called ADH, or antidiuretic hormone. Vasopressin is one of the hormones that helps control your kidneys, and it helps tell your kidneys how much urine you need to make. It also creates a hormone called oxytocin. Now, oxytocin is a female hormone. It affects the uterus. It's also called the labor hormone. This is the hormone that causes the uterus, which is smooth muscle. I remember smooth muscle peristalsis. But in the case of the uterus, it tends to peristalse only when it's told to do so. And it's told to do so with this hormone called oxytocin. And so when a female is pregnant around the time of her labor, her brain will start secreting this hormone, and it tells the uterus to start to squeeze shut. Now, that is the end of the proencephalon. So we're now going to move into the mesencephalon, which is commonly called the midbrain. And again, when you look at the outside of the brain, you can't see anything about the mesencephalon on the outside. You can only see it if you go inside of it. And the mesencephalon is made up of lots of ganglion, like ganglion. These are clusters of nerves that tend to work together. And you have lots of different ones in there. These are just two that we're going to focus on. The first one, corpora. I can never, ever say that word, so I'm not even going to attempt it. I call it the core quad. These are 4 bundles of nerves that you have inside this section of your brain. They sit on top of each other, so you have the inferior and you have the superior. The inferior colliculi and the superior colliculi both deal with reflexes, so they have a lot of unipolar neurons inside of it. But in the case of the inferior colliculi, these are the ones that deal with auditory reflexes. So when you hear a loud noise, your body automatically tenses up into that fight or flight reaction. Or if you hear a large noise, you immediately react. That information probably passed through this section of your brain. Likewise, the superior colliculi deals with visual reflexes. This is what allows you to react really quickly. For example, if you see that somebody has thrown something at you. Now we also have something called a peduncle, and a peduncle is just a fun word to say, but peduncles are basically a fiber highway. It's just a group of nerves. It's kind of like a phone line, and it's how the forebrain gives information to the hindbrain. It's basically how the cerebellum, which is in charge of your involuntary actions, talks to the cerebellum, which is in charge of your voluntary actions. And speaking of those, this is where the rhombencephalon comes in play. And the rhombencephalon is pretty much kind of the bottom of your brain, and so it's often called your hindbrain. Now, here we have the cerebellum, the medulla, and the pons. Now, the medulla and the pons are really interesting because a lot of people actually don't consider them to be parts of the brain. They're actually parts of the top of your spinal cord. It's often called the brain stem. But a lot of people consider them with the brain because they are housed inside the skull. Now, the term the pons means the bridge. And like I mentioned, it's actually part of your brain stem. It's where the spinal cord connects. And it is a major sensory relay station. Remember, sensory nerves are gathering information and taking them up to the brain. And you have so much information that comes to your brain that, like I said before, relay stations help your brain weed things out. And so it also not only helps weed things out through habituation, which is where your brain learns to ignore certain things, like you don't need to feel your clothes on your skin all the time. You don't need to feel your hair brushing up against your skin all the time. Now that I mentioned it, you do, but You have so much information. This is one of the first places that your body starts to ignore certain things. And then as this information is passing up through these spinal nerves, these spinal cord nerves, your body goes, okay, I need to send you to the parietal lobe, or I need to send you to the thalamus, or I need to send you to the occipital lobe. So the pons as a relay station helps the information figure out where it needs to go. We also have this portion called the medulla oblongata, and it is also part of your spinal cord, as part of your brain stem. But again, it's often considered to be parts of the brain because it's housed inside of your cranial cavity. And it is also a relay station. It helps relay impulses between the brain and the spinal cord. But at the same time, it works with the hypothalamus. It helps the hypothalamus control your heartbeat. Remember, your heart beats by itself. It has its own sinoatrial node that creates the electricity, but your brain can't tell it to speed up, slow down, maintain normal beat. This is also the part of your brain that's in charge of your breathing. Now, a lot of times people say, oh, our body, we breathe in order to get oxygen. And yes, that's true. But nothing in your body can register how much oxygen you have in you, because as soon as oxygen gets into cells, the cells start to use them. And oxygen is neutral. But when you mix carbon dioxide with water, you create carboxyl acid. And so as carbon dioxide builds up in our bloodstream, that causes a change in the pH of our blood. And your medulla oblongata is able to recognize that change in pH. So as our blood pH changes, it becomes more acidic due to the buildup of carbon dioxide. The medulla oblongata registers that and basically sets your breathing pattern. It also contains a portion of our nerves that we call reticular formation. And this is what governs arousal of the brain. And what that means is most of us cannot just lay down and immediately go to sleep. We have to slowly drift off. And most of us don't immediately just sit up immediately awake. We slowly drift ourselves awake. We slowly wake up. We slowly begin to hear things. We slowly begin to smell things. Well, this is the portion of your brain that does that. Think of it as a pilot in a plane that has a checklist before they can go flying. Check, 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 check. This is the part of your brain that will slowly turn other parts of your brain off. So for example, if you were to close your eyes right now, your eyes are still turned on. You can see black. But when you go to sleep, your eyes turn off. Well, check, let's turn off our eyes. Let's turn off our optic nerve. But as you start to wake up, your eyes slowly turn back on. This is the portion of the brain that's responsible for that. It is a relay station, so it also helps prevent this idea that we call sensory overload. All this information going to the brain, our brain just cannot handle it. And then the last part is what's called the cerebellum. It is the second largest portion of the brain. And in my first video that I talked about in regards to the brain and spinal cord, we talked about folds. And one of my favorite things that I tell my students is SDF, structure determines function. So you can look at the cerebellum and you can see it's tightly folded. And you can look at the cerebrum, it has more larger folds. Well, if they have two different folds, that's two different structures. They're going to have two different functions. And the cerebellum is the second largest portion of your brain. And the cerebellum controls your skeletal muscles. It controls your voluntary muscle. It also plays some role in emotional processing. Again, we're not really sure how emotions work. And a lot of what we study with the brain is based on studies of people who've had brain trauma, where their personalities changed or their emotions have changed. So that's how we're able to link certain parts of the brain and certain nerves to certain things. It also contains what's called the flocculonodular lobe. It helps maintain equilibrium and balance. Now, your temporal lobe, which is part of your cerebellum, which is part of your cerebrum, is responsible for your sense of sound and your sense of balance. Well, if you think about it, being able to stand up, being able to walk, that's skeletal muscle. So there has to be a way for the temporal lobe, which is the home of your sense of balance, to talk to your cerebellum, which is responsible for your skeletal muscles that hold us up and allow us to move. So the flocculonodular lobe is the group of nerves that allow those two parts of the brain to do that.